Hi, I'm Dr. Hans Toki, and this video tutorial is about policy measurement. Perhaps you've been thinking about measuring some type of a nonprofit policy or government policy or school policy, but you're a little confused about how to go about it. Well, the main idea with the measurement and analysis of policy is finding a way to support a certain policy or build a policy strategy, or indeed might be to oppose a certain policy or another strategy that someone might have. The idea is to connect the policy need, what somebody might need, such as help with the social issues such as immigration or so, or a need such as food or education, to a strategy or a result, how to get someone their papers, how to get food to those who are in need, or to help education. So the connection of policy to strategy is important. Within this, I took my students a few years ago to Trenton, New Jersey, to investigate the policy day. Really, it was the housing day at the state of New Jersey, where what they did is they brought together all of the housing advocates from across the state to argue for low-cost housing for the poor. So we attended the legislative sessions, we went into some committee meetings and observed this process, and of course, there also was some peaceful protest movements on that day advocating for the policies of those who needed housing and low-cost housing. Interestingly, the biggest opposers to this policy for inner city housing were those who had retirement places and retirement homes, because money goes to one or the other. Advocating at the same time for the seniors was the AARP and other very powerful seniors organizations for housing policy money from the state of New Jersey. Towards the end of the day, we had a great time with a guest lecturer that I was privileged to meet. She was the chief lobbyist, lawyer for the city of Trenton. You have to understand the dynamics here. The state government is in Trenton, but it's about a block and a half from very poor living conditions. And her, as the attorney for the state and the advocate for the the city of Trenton, was going across the street to the state to advocate for those people that the politicians were no more than a few blocks from every single day. What she talked about was really interesting. She said, in order to achieve my policy response from the politicians, I don't need to go to those that are sympathetic to my cause. I need to be able to convince those who are not sympathetic to our cause to see it a certain way. Critical to this task, she said, I need to learn to argue from the other side. Listen again, really important. I need to learn to argue from the other side. And so she went on to discuss how, in order to advocate for the people in Trenton, she had to learn and argue from the side of the AARP and the seniors. Not to crush their argument, but to demonstrate that she understood both sides. So the main idea of getting a policy strategy in housing from a need of housing was to argue from the other side. And this requires policy measurement. The textbook concept of policy measurement comes to us from the author Whalen, and he takes a quite quantitative approach to this. He argues that policies are calculable in that we can count heads and numbers in order to achieve our gains. This is done in government bureaucracy all the time, where they'll talk about the taxation money available, the revenues available to pay for this, that, or the other thing. But anyone who has been around the nonprofit organizations knows that everything is not calculable or by the numbers. Pure number crunching metrics can really be difficult for certain things. I'm going to illustrate it with one of my former students. She was a graduate student, and she was at the time an accountant in DC for the really a federal government in taxation. And so her daily life was counting tax dollars and money and so on, and ultimately leads to how the money is distributed to this person and that person. 24 hours a day, this was her world. When she was not actually in the office, she obviously would take a break, but it was a cycle. To get out of the grind, she decided to take this course that I was teaching in nonprofit management. And she went on to describe this really interesting dilemma that she had come across. She was looking for her mission. She didn't find much mission in working for the government. So she began to volunteer at a bread mission, a bread kitchen in inner city DC. What this organization did was they had a number of minivans. It was a very small micro nonprofit, as you call it, who just had people drop by minivan fulls of bread. And then they put up some tables outside on the sidewalk. And any given evening, they would put this bread on the table. And then they would allow the poor and the homeless and others who lived in DC to come and get bread. There was no measurement. Nobody knew exactly how much was being distributed, and so on and so forth. Well, she was aghast at this idea. You have to know how many bread you're doing, and the safety features and all this. She became very much her accountant, bureaucratic self. And then it went bing. She said, I'm being pulled in to this concept of measurement, this calculable approach that all nonprofit work must crunch metrics. Sadly, these days, this has bled itself into a lot of organizations where if you can't produce the numbers, we're not going to give you any money. And so those who have large bureaucratic nonprofits with number crunching and policy measurement get the funds, whereas the little bread kitchen is left wanting. Well, she found as her project, her thesis project then for this course, was to find a way to measure the good that was being done at this bread kitchen. It was phenomenal to watch. So we can't even measure things that you would think are not measurable. There's some basic ways to think about this. What is it that this constituency needs, this group of people needs? And how can we best represent the needs of this group? You would have to get into things like such as the demographics of it, the surveys that have already been done about this group. Maybe the census will tell you something about the group. Or how about look at opinion research that's been done about a certain people group? So you need to really have your numbers about the constituency. Constituency is a group in a certain geography or a certain social cause, a certain social need. You can't just do policy measurement and just, oh, I love this people group. We need to do something. I find a lot of people are do-gooders and they're very altruistic, which is all good. But you really aren't, often some are not doing it from any sense of the position and understanding of this group. We have to have some level of metric as a basic way to think. Then what's the median? Is there a middle approach to how we are to reach this people group? I find these days nonprofits and government policy is drawn to the extreme. Because media hypes the extreme, we have a difficult place to find bipartisan or unified ways to address policy because there's no middle point. As our Jersey lawyer showed us, we have to learn to look from the other side. That hopefully gets us to a balance point for something that can be done. But I make the point that there's some people these days, they have no interest in seeing the other side. They simply are going to say what they're going to say. and that's the only way it goes. Well, that doesn't get you very far. So how can we then agree to disagree? I think this might be a good way to think about the political segmentation that we get on sides of issues. We agree to disagree, but know specifically what it is we're agreeing to that we're disagreeing on. Otherwise, it becomes a rant. It just becomes an explosion. It becomes a fight. Disagreement is healthy in systematic policy analysis because people do have different views of things and bring different perspectives. But it's important to know this. So then, who are the outliers and what's being misrepresented? What is not being said right? What's the antithesis? Knowing this is really important then if we're going to argue from the other side. Look at an independent variable of one individual compared to another. What causes the effects of one to another? An interesting illustration here would be a sidewalk rehabilitation project of how a business improvement district might work it from one way to another. And how much will the policy cause change? What can we calculate before and after? A good illustration of this is the use of eminent domain, where government takes land in order to build public housing or a public need. So what's the rise in real estate values that comes from using eminent domain? Or what's the distribution of the poor that comes from taking low-cost housing? So this becomes how we have to argue from the other side. Look at cost-benefit, before policy, after. What's the change? What's the return on investment from what we do? And what are some case studies that we can look at? So really, in the end, you need to think about the policy need and calculate in your mind what's the best approach to arrive at a certain type of a policy solution where you've considered different sides of it. Then an actual strategy, not just a rant or a protest or a opinion that you stick to. And then find mechanisms, people, individuals that you can argue from the other side with and come to some sort of bipartisan connection for policies that might actually work. So there's a simple tutorial on policy measurement. Have a great day.